Hey everyone, hopefully things are going well today. I'm doing something new today, and what we're really trying to do is we're doing a book review and just some of the lessons I'm learning. I had the opportunity to read this book. Just want to make sure you guys see it. It's called Win the Inside Game. Steve Magness, I think he's done a great job. Um, One of the ways that I know a book is good is what I call just the density of knowledge. And in this scenario, like I really tried reading this book fast and I just couldn't because there was so much packed into the pages, right? Um, I think Steve has done, I've read a couple of his book before. And for those of you who don't know, I used to be a professional athlete. And so one of the coaches that he mentioned, I used to work alongside that. So, Stu and Dan Paff. I think he's done some great work with them. And so whenever I see, Steve writes anything, I always listen because, it's like you find people who resonate with the things that um, you resonate with. This one's an interesting one because he's really just talking about how do we move from surviving to thriving. And I think what I'm going to share is just some highlights from the book and some of the things that really resonated with me. And then, if time persists, what I'm going to do is just saying like how it resonates with me in the day to day. A lot of the examples are from sports, but I think there's a lot we can learn if you work, in corporate America or anything. The book is in, let's say, four parts, and it just starts out of telling you like, why do we, why do we struggle? Why do we struggle? Why do you often struggle to get by? So that's part one. And it's kind of, well, actually, that's the introduction. Part one is he breaks it down in three parts. It's be, do, belong. And so the idea is that in order to move from struggling to thriving, you have to be. So there's like gaining clarity in who you are. He talks about do, like not now it's like clarity in your pursuit, the things that you're going after. And the third part is belonging, and it's like clarity in how you fit in with the world. I think that's really important. And then he wraps it up in a last part of like how do we get unstuck. So I'm gonna jump in some of the highlights for me, and then let me know what you guys think, and we can always do a bit more of this in the book club. All right. So one of the things he talks about is like the idea of arousal, and it talked about like when we're aroused to go or do a pursuit. It says, when we're in that state of arousal, it enhances our memory, cognitive function, helps us to focus a bit more. It prepares our body for action, and it motivates us. So a lot of people thinks about like, oh, we're nervous, or like nothing great happens until we're in that high arousal state. So I think it's like a really cool thing I always think about at work, where it's like, hey, on the track, that was really good. And I could, when I'm getting ready to compete, being aroused was a good thing, not necessarily a bad thing. At work, we need to make sure, like, how do we get back to that place of being aroused and focused, because it helps us to get to where we need to be. One of the things that he mentioned is the idea of like, he says, pressure and stress don't discriminate. It's not just a performance arena that we experience this disconnect between our perception and action. Our desired behavior and actual, who we want to be and who we seem to be. When pressure, uncertainty, and threat overwhelm, we live in survival mode. I think this was like a very important thing that he started out early on. It says, when our sense of self and our worldview are under threat, it is any wonder why our brain sees doom everywhere and acts in accordance. I like this place what he talked about. Like he says, but there was one thing that cool kids did to set them things apart. He started talking about cool kids, which I think was interesting. Of like, okay, cool. I thought I was cool. So what is he saying here about cool kids? One of the differences is like cool kids most often times didn't try. You said trying was for losers. The cool kids stood on the sideline, minimizing their effort, even if deep down they wanted to play a sport, read a book, or ace the test. They were protecting their status and image. And I really thought about that. Like, so many people try to play cool right now because they're afraid of failing. I love this book because it shares a lot of science. It says research has found that depersonalization, where we international detach from aspects of our job, is one of the primary coping mechanisms for workplace burnout. Under preparation is a coping strategy to protect our self of self. Not giving our all is all about shielding our ego from harm. This is a real world version of troking. I think this is really cool and very insightful of like how he talks about depersonalization. I think a lot of this is happening in the world right now at work. and we don't really see it or notice that. He goes on to say, when we feel uncertain, insecure, or under threat, we respond by desperately trying to make ourselves and the world add up. You know, when we can't hold ourselves up to others' ideal, we experience shame, humiliation, and embarrassment. Okay, cool. He goes on to say, and I think it was like, these are some of the things that are starting to come up for me because I've experienced it or seen it. It says, in the workplace, we settle for busy, distracted work to make us feel like we're making progress instead of the deep, focused work that actually moves the needle. And made me start to think how many people, when we talk about productivity and like trying to go there, it's like a lot of it is fake productivity instead of deep mastery work that move the needle for us. There's a couple things he mentioned, which I think is helpful for us to even start to conceptualize about how we defend ourselves and like the way that our body or our system protect us. And he gives your 4 ways that he shared. One of them is we avoid or shut down. This is how we detach. We tell ourselves that whoever expressed this view is crazy, or ensure that we have to confront that information again. So when we get information, we're defending ourselves. The one of the ways is, they said, avoid or shut down. The other is like we fight and defend. So it's like we're doubling down on our position, trying harder to prove that the way we see the world is in fact correct. We rationalize or justify. The other is we narrow and we cling. We shrink our world to the people group, things, or stories that conform our beliefs or worldview. You know, we seek refuge in the places that make us feel secure and value. We make the world two-dimensional so that we don't have to deal with the messiness of life. And then there's a fourth one, which he says either we can accept, we can explore, or update. And this is where we integrate the new information into our mental model, you know. And this is, like I said, 4 ways that he's shown that, like, when we get new information that challenges us, typically we try to defend ourselves in 3 of these 4 ways. So the first one, we avoid or shut down. Second one is we fight and we defend. Third, we narrow and cling. And then the fourth one, which is what great people do, is we accept, we explore, and we update. I think that's really important. I really think he does a great job here of just like constantly sharing and making sure people are aware. It's like, hey, whenever you live in a threat mode, your world narrows. And so it's like us against them. And so I'm curious, when you're at work, whatever environment that you're in, how do you ensure that your people are not living in threat modes, right? He continues to mention certain research about what is it like to have a meaningful life, and there's these 4 examples he gives. So this idea from the book: what is it like to have a meaningful life? Number one, a meaningful life is coherent. It means that life adds up, right? You have a cohesive story, who you are, who you were, and like who you will be. The second thing is significant. You matter. You can make a difference. You can achieve some sort of status in life. The third he mentioned is directed. There's a purpose to your life and pursuits. You have goals leading you towards something. You can make progress. And the last thing he mentioned of like how to have a meaningful life is belonging. It says you're part of something bigger than just you, your family, your friends, your groups. You know, and I think this is very important. I'll reiterate this because I mentioned this at the start, but he mentioned, hey, to have sustainable excellence, 3 things that he wants us to get out of this book is: number one, how do we be? So clarity on who you are. Number two, do clarity in your pursuits. And number three, belong, clarity in where and how we fit in. These 3 things, once we have clarity in these 3 things, we can have sustainable excellence. I thought this was interesting about we talked about failure. A lot of people in sports wrestle with this thing and this idea of like, if I fail today, like who am I, right? um, and a lot of people, I work with people in sales, and it's like what you do isn't who you are. And so he says there's an idea that failure moved from an event to representation of our character, a label that reflected who we were. The simple shift in our story pushed us not towards a story of growth, but one of prevention and a fear of failure. You know, this internalization of outcomes caused us to hand over our power and our self-worth and ourself to others. One of the research that I think was interesting, he says, research shows that acute low-level pressure can improve performance, but chronic or high-level pressure from rank and yang systems actually degrades performance. So there is a right level of of pressure and stress that can improve performance, but at a certain point, very high or chronic levels of pressure and stress can degrade performance. I will want to say this because I hear this a lot, and this is about how do we have sustained performance. He mentioned obsession over outcomes is the most direct path to improvement, but it comes with some downside that shifts us towards avoidance. In a study that he stated, he's saying um, there was an impact of goal setting in sports. Process oriented goals had a large effect on performance. Outcome goals had little to no effect on performance. Today, he mentioned when performance is the only thing, we're fragile. A more sustainable way to make sense of ourselves and our journey in life is to switch to like a quest narrative. And this nudges us back towards exploration. Instead of seeking outcomes and any setback as an indicator that we aren't good enough or that we failed, we need to see our life as a bumpy, meandering path that, with more exploration. This is something that I resonate with a lot. He says labels get rid of the messy details so that we have a cheat sheet for understanding ourselves and others. And the reason why this resonates with me so much, because sometimes I struggle when people try to put me in a box, right? He goes on to talk about labels, and he says they're a shortcut for judgment and understanding. But often these are messy details are necessary, the in between, the things that don't fit in a box. We can't throw them to the wayside without losing something important. So there needs to be a balance. It says over identification with labels is a symptom of the flattening of our world and ourselves. When we reduce ourselves to two dimension, it provides temporary relief, but it makes us fragile. I can relate to this piece so much, right? He talks about, every immigrant is faced with a choice. And he says here, how do I navigate such a rapid and large change? How do I make sense of myself and the journey, holding on to my heritage, where I'm coming from, and the new place where I'm thriving, right? It says, um, it's a tug of war between our heritage and our front. How do you keep on to the whole tradition while flirting with the new? And it's very complex. There's different narratives that we have to pull, and it's very complex, right? And he says when dealing with different cultural identities, we can categorize, compartmentalize, or integrate. Let me repeat this. When dealing with our different cultural identities, we can categorize, compartmentalize, or integrate. Categorization occurs, he says, when you choose one identity over the other. It's about simplifying to avoid the conflict. In a sense, he said it's a zero-sum game, right? Compartmentalization is about separating and narrowing to minimize conflict and achieve, it makes us a bit more fragile. What he really advocates for is integration. It's about reconciling, connecting, and making sense, of the different cultures and what might it look like to integrate. It's seeing the power in the complexity, and I love that idea of there's power in the complex. He gives us this idea of how to thrive in life. He says when we thrive in life, when we're challenged but not threatened, when we have the freedom to take risk, to stretch our limits, to feel what it means to be alive. In our major pursuits, the balance between challenge and threat often sways towards the latter. We've seen a lot of things means a lot to us, and we derive our sense of self from it. We have to learn to put a bit of space between who we are and what we do. In this book, there is a warning for people that are hyper competitive. It says hyper competitiveness is often about needing to win at all costs to protect our identity and our worth. It's linked to more physical and verbal aggression, difficulty maintaining healthy relationships. He goes on another warning. It says when our validation is too heavily weighted to the external, we often spend our time competing in minor things that don't really matter. I will say this. It says, contrary to popular belief, you do not need a win at all cost mentality to have a champion's mindset. I think this is very important for some people because they think we have to win at everything. Like it's us against everyone. That's all that there is. And that's not necessarily what true champion mindset, it's like. It's not like you need constant, validation for, it's these people that will have true champions mindset derive meaning and value from something else. He pulled a quote from 11 Rings for Coach Jackson, and I will be doing this book. So look out for that. It says, in this quote from the book resonates with me as a manager or leader. It says, after years of experimenting, I discovered that the more I tried to exert power directly, the less powerful I became. So he learned to dial back his ego and distribute power as widely as possible without surrendering final authority. It says the most we can hope for is to create the best possible conditions for success. Then we let go of the outcome. He gives us this worldview of how do people perform best. He says we perform best when we feel secure, challenged, but not threatened. We need to ensure environment aligns with our desired future self, where our inner values align with our external actions. I'll leave you with this and this idea of like, how do we get out of survival mode? I think this, as he summed it up, he says, number one, reveal and fill. It says, fill your basic needs with quality, genuine ingredients, right? And do something real, not like on social media. You can't fake your way through it. So that's the first one. It says, decenter is the second. It says, let go of your protective mechanism, your ego, attaching to groups, hiding behind labels. Number three, dislodge. It says we need to update our predictive system. If you feel stuck, change your perspective to get back to exploring, to find a new path. Number four, focus on what matters. You have to align your expectations and experience, your values and actions. There's so much more that I wanted to cover in this book, but hopefully you got some highlights. As I said, definitely check out the book. I think Steve, this might be my favorite book from Steve, maybe because it confirmed or he put into words a lot of things that I've felt over the last 10 to 20 years. So thank you, Steve.